G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute and welcome to our webinar series. Thanks so much for tuning in. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that Canberra is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. The traditional owners here, and obviously sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As you all know, we like to do these webinars at least weekly, but the days and times do vary. So you can head on over to our website at australiainstitute.org.au to our events page, and you should be able to see our upcoming webinars and register for them, including an upcoming conversation we're going to have with activist Chanel Contos about understanding consent. We've also got a webinar with the former EU Trade Commissioner, Cecilia Malmstrom, coming up, and hopefully soon we'll be announcing another one with Ed Miliband as well, which is exciting, from the UK. So thanks for joining us today. Just a few tips before we begin to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can type in questions for our panelists for the second half of the webinar, and you should also be able to upvote other people's questions and make comments on them. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder, this discussion is being recorded, and as always you can find it up on our YouTube channel, which is australiainstitute.tv. Don't forget to subscribe. All of our webinars are free to the public and available there. You can find them all. So Pole Position is our show where we unpack the big political issues and dive into the latest political polling trends from the fortnightly Guardian Essential Poll, which is out today. And we're delighted to welcome back our regular panelists. One of them is running late. Katharine Murphy from Guardian Australia is doing an actual day job watching the Prime Minister's press conference. I believe he's live on air now with the Doherty Institute, looking at the modelling that National Cabinet has been considering about what the vaccination rate needs to be and take-up needs to be before we can start looking at easing restrictions and ending lockdowns and those types of things, opening up the border again, all those types of things. So Katharine will hopefully join us at the conclusion of that. We hope it won't take too long, but we're just not quite sure. But we do have our regular panelists, Pete Lewis, Executive Director at Essential Media, joined by Richard Dennis, our Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, and John Remington, who's from Essential Media as well. We're going to get things started. And this week's Essential Poll covers a variety of vaccination questions, attitudes towards how different levels of government are handling the pandemic response, leadership, all kinds of stuff. And obviously, you know, it's been, as always, a big fortnight in politics. Parliament is back. Even though we've got lockdowns in several states. The Olympics is on. We've got boots on the ground in southwest and western Sydney with the call out of the ADF. There's a lot happening in politics, as always. But Pete, I'll come to you first. In your op-ed for The Guardian today, you really took a swing at boomers.
Well, they're there, aren't they, Ebony? No, seriously, I looked at the data we've got around vaccinations. There is a growing cohort who will say, give me a Pfizer, but I'm not going to touch the AZ. And obviously part of that is a response to just the horrible public messaging from the Prime Minister, particularly that notorious April late night press conference where he breathlessly announced to the world that under 50s would not be recommended AstraZeneca, which I think was translated by a lot of people as saying AstraZeneca's poison. At the time, he was clearly running a dual agenda to give himself a leave pass for the slow rollout. It was already behind schedule. And then ever since, the iterative changes in advice to the point we are today where all the recommendations are that if you're over, I think it's now 18, you should be looking at AstraZeneca. It's being heard by a lot of people. I think it's take your poison. Yeah. But the numbers, as will come up in the charts in a sec, shows that there's close to half the people, even outside that initial zone, the 50s and the 60-year-olds, the boomers who aren't in the cohort that were what I call the COVID kill zone, the group that was really in in line of fire when it comes to, you know, life threatening from the virus, who are just sitting there saying, oh, I'll take the Pfizer when it's available, but I really don't want to take Astra. And I just, you know, I think the world we're in at the moment, where as the PM's on air at the moment, setting out the roadmap, we need more people being prepared to roll up their sleeves and put AstraZeneca in their arm. And, you know, I've had my first AZ shot. I'm waiting for my second. I know there is a risk. I also know that if you monitor for the symptoms, that the risks are very treatable. And it just strikes me that there, particularly amongst older, comfortable Australians, that sense of wait and see, and I'll only take the best stuff. It says a lot about individualism and not a lot about collective spirit. So,
Yeah.
you know, I'm all for, you know, let's get some Pfizer for the kids, whatever. But surely the odds that have been put in front of us, surely this isn't an act of heroism to take AZ. It's basically an act of basic civic duty, and I think more people should be doing it. So,
Yeah.
like I say, the slides will show us a bit. There's also some interesting counterpoints with the other sorts of risk. A lot of the people that won't take AZ.
Yeah, so we'll get to those slides in a second.
Yeah.
But Richard, I wanted to come to you next. You also wrote a little bit this week about, I guess, how the politics of the pandemic have changed a little. What are you seeing at the moment unfolding in politics now that we've got, you know, this ongoing New South Wales lockdown and
yeah,
all kinds of things happening?
Yeah, look, I broadly agree with what Pete was just saying, and I actually think you always got to go back to the start. Last year, this government actually decided not to buy as much Pfizer as was offered. That was a choice it made, and there were reasons for that. But let's be clear, we didn't skimp when it came to giving money to Harvey Norman. We just kind of shoveled money out the door saying, you know, we just got to get on and do stuff. So that was our approach to stimulus. Fine, actually can go along with that. But when it came to buying drugs, we were a bit stingy. And that's led to a shortage, in inverted commas, of Pfizer. And early on in this, back when Scott Morrison said it's not a race, we have to remember that Scott Morrison was saying it's not a race, and I think was actually dog whistling a bit of vaccine hesitancy, because he knew he couldn't kind of supply very fast. So he was taking the heat out of it. He was sort of saying, oh, it's all right that you want to be choosy. It's all right that you want to do this. That's all fine because it's not a race. Because if it was a race, he was going to lose. He hadn't secured enough supply. AstraZeneca wasn't coming on at that stage, and we didn't buy enough Pfizer. So now we've kind of got this, you know, it's like this episode of Survivor where the premiers are all trying to play a zero-sum game. Each of them understandably wants lots of vaccine. Each of them wants Pfizer for the hesitant part of their population. But it's the size of the pie is determined by the Prime Minister, but it's the premiers that are now fighting over it. And I think where the politics has really shifted is that now Gladys Berejiklian is kind of locked into lockdowns, and the Prime Minister is locked into lockdowns. The Prime Minister can no longer play the premiers off against each other. And now we've got basically all of the premiers saying the problem is there's not enough vaccine, versus the Prime Minister who told us it's not a race. Yeah. So I think the death match between the premiers is kind of coming to a draw, and that's dangerous times for the Prime Minister.
But Richard, isn't it also the problem that every time a state calls for Pfizer, it is basically saying the 3 million AZs, thank you, Jared Noonan, who's trolling me for using the American pronunciation. I accept that, it's AZ. There's 3 million sitting on the shelf, and we're going, it's not good enough for us, collectively. And each time the Premier says we need more Pfizer, it's part of it as well. So I'm even concerned about this whole that Pfizer will save us is just building into this narrative that the perfectly adequate vaccine that will do the job that's sitting there at the moment that we can manufacture locally rather than paying a premium is all going to be going off being sent to developing nations, and we'll feel good about ourselves because we'll call it foreign aid. I just think there is a cognitive dissonance based on our privilege here, which is going to prolong the lockdown and potentially put younger people at risk in the long term. So
yeah, I agree with the science of what you're saying, but I just think the reality is, you know, you only get one chance to make a first impression, or whatever the saying is. And to some extent, we've blown that. And now that there is this concern amongst some people, now that there is this hesitancy, leaving aside where it came from, it's there. And the premiers are just trying to, I think, solve the actual problem. And that is, they want a needle in everybody's arm. And the premiers don't think they themselves can kind of overcome the Prime Minister's appalling first impression. So, yeah, Australia's wound up, you know, Mr. Communicator, Mr. Marketing, you know, has really destroyed the marketing of vaccines.
Well,
both
he
in terms
branded
of,
it as poison.
Well,
So, you
that
know, there you
takes
go.
me to the actual
Numbers.
essential poll results today. So, Pete, can you walk us through what this slide is telling us about?
So if you look from left to right on each of those, you'll look at each month, the reaction. So we've been tracking this over 4 months, and John will jump in if I get any of this wrong. The ones that I want you to look at is the third set of bars across from the left. Would get Pfizer, not Astra, has gone up from 28% in April to 47% in August. Now, partly that will be that the people that are prepared to get Astra are removing themselves from the sample of the unvaccinated, right? So it's not that you're necessarily saying there is a shift, but in terms of those, the cohort, the 75 that haven't even had a first dose, that number who will not get Astra is at 47. There's another 14% who won't get any of them. So they are your anti-vaxxers. And there's another 12% even in lockdown that are scratching their heads. Now you do the numbers on that and you're close to 70% of the population. The other interesting thing is amongst younger people now, 1 in 20 is saying, I'll get Astra and not Pfizer. Now they're the, you know, in terms of, you know, vaccine nationalism, they're the true patriots. I just wonder if we shouldn't be giving everyone that takes the Astra a badge to wear around to say that, you know, I really will do my bit.
Yeah, we should let everyone know that Katharine Murphy's still watching the Prime Minister's press conference, doing her real job, so to speak. And she should be with us hopefully in the next 5 minutes or so. Pete, you also asked...
Oh, just back on that one, sorry, Eb. On the right-hand side, there is the age. So these are the different age groups. So the 50 to 59s, which, you know, in fairness, they're my people. The Gen Xers have been buffeted a bit because we were told that it was okay and they're not okay. But the 60 to 69s, which are your boomers, who are the message the whole way along has been, this is a recommended vaccine for you. 41% of them won't touch the stuff.
It's a lot. It's a big chunk, isn't it? And the point, what's the point of asking this about risky behaviour, Pete?
Well, you won't take the AstraZeneca because of your minuscule risk, but of the people that won't take it, 20% have smoked in the last 2 years, 12% have taken recreational drugs, like in terms of boomer lifestyle, still living the dream. You know, 43% are drinking beyond the safeguards. 34% are either riding a bike or texting while driving. And of the females only, 20 are on birth control. So if you add all that up, of those who say they will not take Astra but will take Pfizer, 63% in total admitted to one of those risk-taking behaviours. So I just think, I'm just calling out some BS here, guys.
Yeah. And then this one, and then we might come back a little bit, but I thought this was really interesting because people have really divergent views on some of these measures and around vaccine passports. So on the one hand, you can certainly see requiring people to have vaccines in certain, I guess, workplaces or situations makes a lot of sense. But I really took to heart Malarndirri McCarthy, the Labor senator's points this week, where she talked about, you know, we can't create two classes of citizens. That really struck out to me. There'll be, you know, people who can't access the vaccine for some reason or other, but it looks like kind of people back the idea of vaccine passports. They're pretty popular.
And the interesting thing about these numbers, they include the people that say they're not going to take a vaccine as well. So you'd say there's strong support for these measures. Now, I heard those comments as well, and it gives me pause to thought about, particularly with Indigenous communities, how that issue is managed. But if we're going to be in a world where we need people to listen to the science and take vaccines and they don't, then should the rest of us be deprived of the life we used to know because of that? So I'm all up for the vaccine passport.
I get that, but Richard, you know, like 72% agreeing that we should require people to prove they're vaccinated before traveling interstate. How many people are we going to trap within their state with that kind of a policy? Like, if you look at it from the other end, it's...
Yeah, look, I must admit, I'm a bit apathetic, if not opposed to some of this stuff. Don't get me wrong, please, if you're watching this, get yourself vaccinated. But gee, there's this authoritarian streak in Australians, isn't there? Like, it's pretty close to the surface, and politicians know how to use that. They know how to divide and conquer. They know how to play one group off against another. And there are people out there who, for medical reasons, can't get vaccinated or come with a lot higher risk. There are some people who are legitimately kind of conscientious objectors to that. But at the same time, if we can't get vaccination rates up very high, a whole bunch of people are going to either get sick or die. So don't get me wrong. I think that if there are just some people out there saying, stuff it, I don't want to get vaccinated, you know, the 5G implants aren't coming into my body, at some point we all actually have to think, all right, how much sacrifice are we all going to take to protect that? But that's a complicated conversation, and I think for me it's a bit too early to say, show me your paperwork or I'm not letting you leave the state. Because
without the carrot, what do you have? You have this complacency that just drags on, Richard.
Oh, look, but Pete, I don't mind that we're having this conversation. I don't mean you and I mean nationally. I don't mind that our leaders are starting to say to people, you know, if we can't get to these points, you might get left behind. I don't think it's wrong to foreshadow that at some point we might have to either curb the freedoms of some people or accept that some people have chosen, just as we let people choose to smoke, if people choose to take on more COVID risk, the libertarian in me is kind of okay with that. So no, I don't mind that we've started a public conversation about this at all. I guess I'm just personally not locking into what the carrot and what the stick should look like. I think what we should be doing is making it really easy for people to get vaccinated. And, you know, I think the polling's interesting, the no's and the unsures are non-trivial, but we know from all of economics and all of behavioral psychology and all of marketing that there's a big difference between someone saying, I might buy a car this year, and someone buying a car this year. And I actually think that what good websites do, what good retailers do, is turn the slightest of intention into an action. And I don't think that with our sort of vaccine approach at the moment, that we're kind of making it easy enough for the people that are kind of intending to get vaccinated. And I think we're going to need to send out, you know, mobile vaccine squads to workplaces, to community groups. There's a whole bunch of proactive things that if we had enough supply and we were serious, we'd be really doing that. And I'd like to see a lot more of that before I jump to the stick. But I agree, at some point, we all collectively have to make some hard decisions about risks and choices.
Yeah, I can see that Katharine has joined us now. Hi, Katharine. Thank you for...
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to be late. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
It's still going, so it's...
we were going through some of the numbers from the poll around, you know, people wanting to get vaccinated with Pfizer rather than AstraZeneca. And then we got into the territory of whether or not we should have vaccine passports, which are pretty popular. But, you know, commenting on Malandiri McCarthy kind of talking about creating two classes of citizens there, and not everyone might have ready access or be able to vaccinate, for example, which we thought also raised good points. But the PM was talking about, if I'm correct, the Doherty Institute modelling about when we can hopefully open up and what level of saturation we'll need. What's the latest from the Prime Minister, Katharine?
Well, that's a very good question, Eb. I've just sat through a press conference that's run for about 40 minutes. That was sort of one of the more bamboozling press conferences I've sat through. So the Prime Minister or the government's produced the Doherty modelling. It wasn't distributed prior to the press conference, so none of us have seen it. Prior to the press conference, the Doherty Institute presented it, and I'm sure once we read it, it'll make eminent sense, and the messaging around it reinforces sort of where the National Cabinet landed last Friday in terms of thresholds for when we might be able to open up. But yeah, it's I'm still shaking my head about what just happened. Really, it was suboptimal. Doesn't even begin to describe what's just happened.
And not ideal, certainly, when there's been so much confusion around all this kind of to begin with, and sowing the seeds of doubt.
Yeah,
when we really need clarity, I guess.
Yeah. I really don't understand. I mean, look, I suppose I do understand. The government obviously quite correctly wanted to be transparent about the modelling at such a time when it felt it was able to. I'm also a fan of experts talking to their own work rather than it being refracted through a political lens. But yeah, look, just as a communications exercise, look, I can promise everybody that's on the webinar today, we will make sense of this by close of business, and probably given how fast we work, within an hour or two. But yes, anyway, I'd love to be able to bring you a very clear explanation of what's happened, but that is beyond my mental capabilities, I'm afraid.
Yeah, Katharine, we'll go back to the slides shortly, kind of looking at people's attitudes towards the responses from different levels of government, because I think there's some interesting stuff in there. But just the last couple of weeks of the politics of the pandemic, we've seen New South Wales, kind of the police chief call out the ADF to put boots on the ground, so to speak, that they walked pretty quickly away from that language. Now they're doing food drops and wearing high vis, trying to hide the camouflage outfits and things. But there's been a fair bit happening. It's been quite fast moving, even though everyone in Sydney's, still in extended lockdown. What's your observations from the last couple of weeks that have stood out to you?
Yeah, like a hell of a couple of weeks, really, hasn't it? Bang. And hello to everybody watching from Sydney. It's really difficult. It's really difficult there at the moment. I have family and friends there, and it is really, really difficult. So yeah, it's funny, really. I feel like over the last couple of weeks, we've gone back to the start of the pandemic. And I don't say that to depress everybody in Sydney, that we're going to have to replay the entire 18 months that we've just lived through again. I don't mean it really in that way. I just mean the Delta strain has sort of picked us all up, put us down in a familiar but slightly different spot. And now we're seeing, we're sort of back in a way to where we were in the second wave last year. But we've sort of seen some very rapid fire pivots, though, around the politics of lockdowns. Like, one thing we have seen, courtesy of this Doherty modelling, is that now lockdowns are essential. Whereas last year we had a strange kind of partisan overlay about lockdowns perhaps not being essential. So it's sort of like we're back to the start, and everything looks familiar, but everything's also slightly different as well. So is the best way I can describe it. And look, in terms of the polling, which is really the nub of your question, Eb, it's, what does it show us? Well, I don't know how far you guys have gotten through the slides, but we've got Gladys Berejiklian's approval, or the approval of her government, below 50% for the first time in the pandemic. And we still see, even though the Prime Minister's rising disapproval seems to be stabilising in this poll, although I'd want another fortnight before I called that. We see this dissatisfaction with the public about the political management of events in recent times. But anyway, I'm either, Pete, am I skipping way ahead or way behind?
Well, we actually we went backwards on the deck with you not being here, so you're kind of at the right point.
Oh, I've come in with exactly the right segue.
Yeah, so if you go back the two, Eb, so we track all the time federal government response, and people can do they're the very good and quite good. That's down to its lowest, I'm going to say ever, 38 combined approval now of the government's handling. And then if you look at state by state, where, which is the next slide, sorry. Ding. Yeah, it's dropping off everywhere, isn't it? Even where there was a little bit of a WA bounce, although they're small samples. So that's federal government support in different states. So it's down, 33, 39. That was tracking at, 60s and 70s last year. So that whole sense that the government was standing up and doing its job through 2020 is collapsing at a rate of knots. Part of Katharine's confusion of today's presser is probably part of that. People just don't know what the plan is, but also, the sense that New South Wales showed an alternate isn't holding either. These are the attitudes towards the state governments. WA and South Australia still going pretty well. Queensland, John will tell me if I'm wrong, but that's probably before their lockdown. And then, a bounce back for the Victorian government after their short, sharp lockdown back into the net positive. The other thing people will notice is that in all those tables, the regard for state is significantly higher than the regard for federal's management of the COVID-19.
So this next one was what I thought was really interesting. So this is the various states, people rating their own state governments handling of the pandemic. Pete, do you want to walk us through?
Yeah. So these are of the latest outbreak, so as opposed to the pandemic in general. And this is where the New South Wales government's got a combined 24, either extremely or very well, as opposed to, 40 odd, not that well, not at all well. Victoria and Queensland governments seem to have fared better. South Australia very well. So it's just, I think a couple of weeks ago, I said the big shift, last year's pandemic, we were forgiving our government because we were in a once in a generation black swan event. This year, we're seeing it as a failure of government. And I think that's showing in a lot of these numbers.
Yeah, Katharine, your point about it feeling a bit like, the second wave last year, we've been kind of talking about that all week in the office here. I just said it feels kind of like March and April from 2020. Is that what you think we're seeing there in those results, that where the outbreaks have happened again, people are just less forgiving because it feels like the same time last year, but we should have learnt what to do by now?
Well, yeah, I think it's sort of like, it reflects a number of things, doesn't it? It reflects the general fatigue in the nation, even though Australia comparatively has had it a lot easier than a lot of other countries. Of course, you only know what you know and what you've experienced, and so I think we've sort of hit a fatigue point, I guess, in the pandemic where the sort of realization is starting to settle on people that COVID normal, will contain a number of COVID characteristics, if that makes sense. It's not like somebody can snap their fingers and then we go back to where things were at before the pandemic. That's really not how this is going to play out, at least not in the foreseeable future. We're going to sort of bump back in the direction of COVID normal over a period of time. And so I presume that realization is starting to settle on people who have been through different lockdowns at different phases and now understand that, that this is, that this event, this pandemic, just as the global financial crisis did before it, has picked up the world and put it down in a different place. And then once those realizations sort of start to settle on people, then they they're looking at their governments through a lens of fatigue rather than the sort of early inclination, which has been obvious in this data series and obvious to Pete and I from the beginning, is that there was this sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, sort of patience, I think, on the part of the Australian people, that they were prepared to cut governments a break, right? Because this is a big, serious pandemic. Everyone was working really hard. Everybody was seen to be doing their best. People were inclined to cut them a break. Well, we've reached the end of a collective tolerance around that, I think, and that's what we're seeing in the numbers. Now, I don't think people are viscerally ropeable, even in New South Wales. I mean, like, that's a big slide, obviously, but I don't think people are viscerally ropeable. Everybody understands that some of this is outside the control of governments, however competent. But I think people are judging the competence or otherwise of their governments more particularly with more information based on their lived experience and through a lens of, oh my God, when are we going to get out of 2020? Because it's like, it feels like at least a couple of decades, 2020, you know?
Yeah. And I think this next one also really stood out to me from the results, which is asking people, thinking about the latest COVID lockdown in your state, and do you think your state government lockdown at the right level, too harshly or not hard enough? And so we can see there that in South Australia and Victoria, quite obviously, most people kind of thinking it was about the right level, not so much in New South Wales.
Yeah, practice makes perfect in Victoria.
Yeah.
Oh God, oh, we love you, Victoria. But there's also that number. I don't know if we've done it yet, guys, but 50% of the sample in New South Wales, which is obviously a smaller sample in this data series, think that Gladys didn't lock down fast enough. Basically, 50% in New South Wales now.
Richard, obviously the politics of locking down or not, and you know, the PM was quite anti them at one point. He's had to soften that language quite a bit and have a bit of a turnaround. Does that do those numbers kind of accord with what you're hearing from the community about people judging whether or not New South Wales went early enough? I mean, the proof's in.
Look, absolutely. I mean, turn the question on its head, and let's look back in the last 12 months and say, which premier do we want to criticise for locking down too early? Like, which was the lockdown in South Australia, in Queensland, in Western Australia? Where was it? Where's the one that we'd all like to, in hindsight, pile on and say they were a bit trigger happy, weren't they? So Gladys has got a real problem because her whole kind of identity was wrapped up in I'm not spooked like all these other premiers. I can tough it out. Well, in hindsight, that was a disastrous decision. It cost Sydney at least 4, maybe 6 weeks of extra lockdown. And, you know, I think the politics of this are fascinating because, again, you know, let's be clear. Why does the Prime Minister love lockdowns now? What's changed? The only thing that's changed is that he doesn't want to get blamed for slow vaccine rollout, right? Because there's only 2 explanations available to us now. You know, you either like vaccines or lockdowns. And the Prime Minister doesn't want us to love vaccines. He wants, because he can't solve that problem. Now he's pivoted, you know, typically, you know, it's the pirouette of the pandemic, as I called it in my latest piece. You know, he's now so 100% lockdowns are good because he's terrified of actually getting blamed for any shortage of vaccine. So, which
is a remarkable statement about a Prime Minister terrified of being blamed. It feels like he's lost his bottle a bit.
Well, exactly. But I mean, let's think back to the bushfires when he said, "I don't hold a hose." I don't think any of us here thought he would ever make a blunder that big ever again. But then he went and said, it's not a race. You know, so this guy has just got so much baggage now. And I think that for the vast majority of the population that kind of don't tune in every day and pay attention to the ups and downs, they certainly heard him say, I don't hold a hose. They certainly heard him say it's not a race. And he's the guy that spent a year saying we don't need to build quarantine stations. So, yeah, he's got to blame anyone but himself at the moment. And as Pete said, that's ultimately not the job of Prime Minister, but it's not even obvious that it's a good political strategy.
Yeah, Katharine, that reminds me a bit of the essay that you wrote last year on the Prime Minister and how he gets some of those big early calls quite wrong. Do you think, like we talked about the kind of grace, the patience that voters have showed, do you think some of those past poor decisions are now really starting to define him, that he just doesn't get those big calls right initially?
Well, it's sort of, I guess the test of this will be whether sentiment starts to turn once the sort of vaccination rates increase. I think it's sort of, it's exactly the right question, Eb, but in terms of how this all washes through, it's sort of not clear to me whether people are going to hold a grudge about this or not yet. I mean, gut tells you yes. Gut tells you that they will hold a grudge because, like you say, it's sort of, I think we've said this a couple of times on the webinar here, the longer you hang around in politics, the more your negatives increase because people get to know you, they get to know your habits, they can anticipate, your little sort of rhetorical pirouettes, as Richard says. People, it's sort of like, the uncle at the wedding, right? You can sort of anticipate how the behaviour is going to manifest itself, right? So the longer people stay in politics, the more their negatives increase. There is a pattern of behaviour in front of voters now that they didn't have, obviously, in 2019 when Scott Morrison genuinely was a brand new Prime Minister. Even though he was a political veteran, he didn't have a record, really. He was a Prime Minister without a record. Now he is a Prime Minister with a record. And the record this year has not been very competent. Gut tells you that voters won't forget that, but things can change. And the thing too about sentiment, if we look at how it's played out in the States, just quickly, right? It's sort of largely been logical and it has followed events down and up. It's sort of like if we look at what's happened in Victoria, right? Down and up. In New South Wales, we're just sort of hitting down. Berejiklian hasn't come down before. Now, what happens post the Sydney lockdown? Do people blame her and do they hold a grudge? I don't know. I'd love a crystal ball. If anyone's got one, send one to the Parliamentary Press Gallery because I could really use one. Gut says he's accumulated some baggage that's bad for him and that Labor can now present a portrait of a Prime Minister that is not very flattering. But also Australians are resilient, forgiving people too.
Yeah. My gut told me that Tony Abbott was unelectable. So that's why I like polling and elections because that's what people actually do.
I think rash prediction. I hate rash predictions. I'm not in the rash predictions business.
So we might come back to the last of the slides towards the end and get to a couple of questions from the audience here. There's a couple of good ones and a couple from out of left field. So where was the first one that I was going to ask here? This one's from Claire Baxter, and Pete, it might be one for you or John here. It says, do you think the majority of people are genuinely scared of blood clots, or are they just using it as an excuse for not wanting to take what they think is the less effective vaccine based on early reporting?
Obviously, with the polling questions we're putting in the field, we can't draw a conclusion on that. What I think that we have continued to pick up, and John, chime in if you like, is a sense of complacency that we can, as I said earlier, wait for the best. And it feels like a very Australian mindset. I hate to see what we look like from elsewhere in the world, the poor little rich country who just won't take its medicine. So sorry, that's not really answering the question. The data doesn't tell us.
That's all right. John, was there anything you want to...
No, I think as Pete said, that a lot of what we do is we are aware of various biases when people do answer, and possibly like a lot of people in the audience today are thinking about what vaccines to get. Do I want to book in for AstraZeneca or Pfizer? You go through a lot of reflection on whether or not you are really concerned about the side effects, whether or not I've thought about the health implications and the risks of not doing it. So we try and we get questions which will, I think the idea is that we get down to this level, but with the surveys that we're doing, really getting into the unconscious biases and rationale for getting a vaccine and not getting vaccines a little bit beyond what we can do with this survey.
Can I throw in, like, let's put vaccines aside for a moment and just look at the full horror of Australians making decisions. Australians don't make rational decisions about their choice of bank. Australians don't make rational decisions about their exercise habits or their diet, or like we could go all
Climate
day. Climate change, right? So this fantasy, this absolute bonkers fantasy that if you put good information in front of Australians, they'll make good decisions, is baseless. And bizarrely, like the whole bunch of people waving evidence around ignore all of the evidence about how humans actually make decisions. Like if people shopped around on evidence, then no one watching this today would have a mortgage with the big four banks. And I'm betting that a third to a half of them do. And they're paying way too much. And having taught economics for 25 years, I've failed spectacularly to convince people to switch to cheaper mortgages. So, you know, I think we have to be very, and in other countries, what drove the vaccination was fear. Right, let's own this, right? They were afraid because there was an outbreak ripping through and their hospitals were full. And it's horrible to think about, but that's what drove the uptake. And here in Australia, we didn't have that. And that's fantastic. Well done, us. But we're sitting around being surprised that a bunch of humans aren't persuaded to do the smart thing when we put data in front of them. Well, I've been putting data in front of people for years saying, would you please do the smart thing? And everyone's got an excuse. I'm busy, the gym's too far away. If I, you know, ice cream's not that, whatever. Like that's what humans do. And our whole body politic seems to be a bit surprised by this at the moment.
Spoken with the frustration of a lifelong economy.
and to be clear, that's why I'm saying we've got to show up at people's workplaces and say, here's a needle, tell me you don't want it. We're going to show up at people's social clubs and say, here's a needle, tell me you don't want it. Like, because Australians aren't as afraid, and that's a good thing that we're not that afraid, but because we don't have fear motivating all that behavior, the idea that just a well-organized, rational decision-making populace will pop in and do the sensible thing. Well, okay, how come no one's got around to consolidating their super yet?
But my only point there, and I agree, Richard, is surely the other point is a bit of social pressure. And I know I'm pushing the boundary and going anti-boomer, but there is a serious point here that we, you know, and as I say, you know, all the marketing people say you only bring out the best in people, tell them they're great, buy my product. Surely there's got to be, hold on, like harden up, guys, and, you know, take the medical evidence and do it.
A bit of shame-based marketing certainly works for water restrictions, for example, in the middle of drought. So there's different approaches, shall we say. The next question I wanted to ask is from Eric Pozza. He says, what are your thoughts on Labor and its approach to election? And by that, he means dumping of the various tax policies and negative gearing and all of that type of thing. Katharine, how do you think that went down?
Well, it's interesting, and again, like sort of correlation, not causation, and all that. It's interesting that Anthony Albanese took a hit in on approvals in this fortnight, and that coincides with Labor stepping off, stepping into support of the stage 3 tax cuts and abandoning their negative gearing policies and some spending policies that they outlined in 2019. Now, I don't know. I genuinely don't know if those two events are linked. It would suggest people are watching very closely and are filtering what the Labor Party is doing through the fog of the pandemic, which I'm slightly sceptical about. But anyway, maybe the maybe that information did reach people and they had a reaction to them. In terms of what are they doing? Well, that's pretty easy to answer. They're trying to win an election. They basically have spent, I think it really is that simple. I think Anthony Albanese is trying to, well, we used to say in the Howard era, cleaning the barnacles. I think the analogy these days is lightening the load. He's trying to lighten the load before we get into the election season proper, and that means sort of stepping back from policies that are hard to argue for, or could be, more pertinently, could be weaponised in a campaign, and that's some of the decision making. It's not like Labor sat around, had a session, thought the stage 3 tax cuts are really great policy. I'm yet to find someone in the Labor Party who thinks the stage 3 tax cuts are really great policy, but it is what it is. I'm not saying that as an apologia or a justification. I wrote a column on Saturday basically saying it was bad policy, and it is bad policy, but they want to remove the obstacles to their own election. And you can also understand this is a political party that's gone through 2 election cycles promising a complete and progressive policy agenda that has been rejected by the Australian people at 2 elections. So, if you can't win the argument, I guess you adjust the product, and that's what Anthony Albanese is doing. And he's not doing that for, to sort of court progressive votes. He's doing that to try and give people who are currently voting for the coalition and feel they can't vote for Labor for whatever reason, a prompt to reassess that choice. It reflects the fact that Labor is going after coalition-held seats at the next election. It's not getting or not intending to tie itself up in progressive on progressive battles in the inner city.
The next question is from Richard Bentley, and this one's for you, Richard. It says, will the economy need a $300 a person boost by December? Is there clear evidence to support that? So that's in reference to another policy announcement by Labor out today, where they're recommending a kind of $300 bonus reward essentially for everyone who's fully vaccinated by December. Richard, how's the economy looking with New South Wales in lockdown?
Look, the economy is looking far worse than it did at the point in time where the Morrison government decided to scrap JobKeeper. Now, obviously, JobKeeper had design problems. It wasn't perfect, but it's interesting. We said this at the time, but let's look at it in hindsight. When JobKeeper was scrapped, and when the Job Seeker supplement was scrapped, what a perfect time for a forward-looking government to say, all right, so we've got rid of those. We don't need them. But when there's a lockdown and there's a localized economic problem, here's what the new package will look like. So if you're getting rid of JobKeeper because the crisis is over, but you can anticipate that Gladys might have a lockdown one day, why not back then say, here's what it'll look like? But of course, at that stage, the government was trying to say, it's all good news, everything's going to be great. And only Daniel Andrews and people like that want to have lockdowns. So I don't need, as the Prime Minister, to come up with a lockdown support package. Now, that's going to hurt both him, it's already hurt Victoria, and I think it's already hurt New South Wales, because rather than being able to act quickly and say, right, terrible to see that you had to have this lockdown, here's what the federal government support package looked like, because we had to filter it through, but it's a Victorian lockdown. And I'm not kidding, this is a quote. The government said they didn't want to give Daniel Andrews an incentive to keep locking down. They didn't want to give him an incentive to lengthen lockdowns. So we're actually treating a state premier the way we treat a so-called dole bludger. I don't want to look too generous, because I know moral hazard means that the unemployed people won't look for work. And I know moral hazard means Daniel Andrews, just think about this, Daniel Andrews will keep everybody locked down if I give him some money. So the federal government didn't come up with a replacement for JobKeeper because politics said it didn't need one. So sadly, that means that this lockdown's been going on, support was late coming. And yeah, look, it's really simple. If if there's unemployment and no inflation, then we can afford and will probably need $300 getting posted to people by the end of the year.
Yeah. This next question's a bit from left field and not related to the poll, but it's one I would like all three of you to answer. What are your thoughts on the expansion of Sky News into regional Australia, and what role do you think this will play in the upcoming election? Who wants to tackle that one first?
Oh, God. All right, let me do that. Look, the expansion of Sky into the regions is not a brand new phenomenon. This is something that MPs have been talking about really here over, several months, probably 12 months, really, that this is a thing and an issue to manage. It's also well, God, we could do about 3 hours on this episode, so let me try and be brief. It's like the sort of expansion of Sky into the regions comes at a time when regional media is quite weak. Again, politicians out on the stump of all parties have really noticed over the last couple of years when they go out to, do the marginal seats tour of Australia without the national media with them, when they're basically just relying on local coverage, how denuded regional media has become as our industry, the economics of our industry has been upended by the internet. So there's been this huge rationalisation of regional media to the point where a number of MPs from both sides, all sides of politics, tell me now the only way to communicate with voters outside the metros is Facebook, because trying to get a message in a local paper, well, you've got to find the local paper first, and then you've got to, sort of deal with the person, who is cleaning the office, selling the ads, and trying to keep a local paper together, right? So it's just a preamble saying there's been a big rationalisation in the regions, in comes Sky, and like I said, there's been parliamentarians here very attentive to this for more than a year, that this is happening, that this will have an impact, and a lot of people not entirely thrilled about it, because there's obviously a fundamental difference in programming from day to night. The sort of day, still remains, I think, reasonably straight news coverage, sort of rolling coverage. In the evening, we have the sort of opinionistas sort of at 20 paces, and there's been some controversy about Sky having to take down videos, for example, about vaccination over the last little bit. So
yeah, they got banned from YouTube for 7 days.
They got banned from YouTube, and then that's opened a conversation about what the hell were the regulators doing, which is also a very interesting conversation as well. Anyway, so look, big things happening. It sort of plays into the whole disruption of the media that I've been writing about for years. This has profound implications in a democracy. People need to be very attuned to that. That's the short version of that conversation.
Yeah, the other significant thing is that it's come out from behind the paywall, which is more so it's free to air, delivering the Sky After Dark product into the regions, which has echoes of the strategy in the States, where your Fox News isn't paid for there, it's bundled with your bandwidth, with your pay TV service. So there's this piggybacking of propaganda on the back of telecommunication infrastructure. That seems to me something that bears a little bit of scrutiny.
Richard, Kevin Rudd, what didn't seem to be a big fan of this. What's your take? Katharine's outlined the huge problems with regional media. Does it throw up any other issues in terms of competition, media diversity, that type of thing?
Oh, absolutely. And, I think it's interesting that just last year, the federal government gave $20 million to the AAP Newswire service, in part because AAP kind of props up a lot of those regional newspapers. So I think that people, politicians, federal politicians, state politicians can see what's happening here. But let me just be a little glass half full here, purely political, not policy. I think it's you know, if we had decent competition laws and media ownership laws, this wouldn't be happening. Like, we wouldn't give even more market power to an existing dominant outlet. Like, it's ridiculous, but this is Australia and it's broken. So let's just take for granted that not only is it happening, but the taxpayer subsidises Sky. I mean, how good are we? But how's this going to help the coalition? I mean, Josh Frydenberg has managed to take the blue ribbon seat of Kooyong and turn it literally into a marginal seat, right? He delivered the lowest ever primary vote for the Liberals in the seat of Kooyong. And that was before he was treasurer in the government that refused to help Victoria and is going to shovel money onto Sydney. So Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney, the Liberals in those seats are under real pressure from basically the coalition's determination to be crazy on vaccines and crazy on climate change and crazy on all these culture wars to appease the Nationals. So if what Sky does is turn regional Australia more rabid, then that's going to be very bad news for your Josh Frydenbergs, your Trent Zimmermans, your Dave Sharmas, who are actually trying to convince increasingly the children of blue ribbon Liberal voters that voting for the party of Barnaby Joyce and George Christensen is a good idea. So it's bad for our democracy, it's dangerous, it's divisive, but I think it's actually going to rip the Liberal National Coalition apart as much as it rips into the fabric of Australian democracy.
That's an interesting
Silver lining.
And I will just give a quick plug to our book, The Nordic Edge, in the back there. I actually wrote a chapter on media diversity and that perhaps the time had come for direct subsidies in order to protect journalism and media diversity and voices. A lot of the Nordic countries do that. And we have seen the government step up and provide direct subsidies, particularly during the pandemic, but particularly in regional areas where, as Katharine said, there's a lot of news deserts out there now. That might be something that we hope the government looks at soon. Still available in all good bookshops behind me there. We're probably out of time, but if I can just get final thoughts for the next 2 weeks ahead, if in just a minute, I guess, what do you think's coming down the pipeline in the next 2 weeks in terms of politics? I'll start with you, Richard.
Look, I think we're going to see a national impact on the economy from what's happening in Sydney. I think the government is playing catch up now. To its credit, it was very on the front foot at the beginning of this crisis with stimulus. It's been slow out of the blocks with Sydney. And I think we're going to see unemployment start to rise and people talk a lot more about double dip recessions.
Pete?
Being someone that's in Sydney, it's just whether there is any bending of this, trend line of, between high 100s and 200 new cases a day, a lot of them out in the community. Does the mockdown still carry its echoes across Sydney? And, what is going to be not just the political cost, but the human cost of this city over the next, 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks, however long it goes.
Yeah. And Katharine?
Well, just summing up, I think it's sort of COVID. It's surround sound COVID. It's what happens in Sydney. Things don't look great in Queensland either, I've got to say. Hopefully I'm wrong about that. It doesn't look brilliant up there at the moment either. So I think, we're basically sort of going to be focused on the lived reality that Pete mentioned and the dynamics that Richard's talking about, I think.
Yes, I'm feeling #blessed to live in Canberra at the moment. And I got my text message from ACT Health this morning to book my Pfizer jab, which I have done for September. I did look around to see if I could get AstraZeneca sometime sooner because it feels a bit like just waiting for a case to get here from Sydney. Shout out to everyone who's joining us from lockdown. We hope you're hanging in there and encourage everyone to go out and get vaccinated as soon as possible if you can. And obviously we realise that's not available as an option to everyone either. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Katharine Murphy, for joining us, if a little bit late for doing your actual day job.
Sorry about that, guys.
Watching the Prime Minister. We appreciate your time. Thanks, Pete. Richard and John as well. And thanks everyone for your great questions. As always, I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We had close to 800 people on with us today. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget, we've got more exciting webinars coming up. You can find all those at australiainstitute.org.au. And don't forget to tune in and subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money. This afternoon, we'll be looking at, in our new episode, the principles of what makes a good tax, following on from the Labor decision to dump a couple of tax reforms. We'll be looking at that kind of stripped of the context of politics and looking at the pure economics of what makes a good tax. And last week we discussed why the government always, when the going gets tough, calls in the troops. So a couple of good episodes there on Follow the Money. And thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe out there, everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks for listening.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.